My name is Caleb, and I'm 52 years old. I own a small used car dealership, one that I built from the ground up. When I first started, I didn't have much, just a few $1,000s saved from working at my father's modest garage. My dad passed away when I was barely out of high school, leaving me with whatever little he had. It wasn't a fortune, but I made the most of it, working tirelessly to climb my way up. I spent years pulling double shifts, saving every penny I could. Gradually, that empty lot transformed into a fully operating dealership. I've never been wealthy, and I don't live in a big, luxurious home, but that never mattered to me. I'm a simple, straightforward guy. The people in this town know me, they trust me, and to me, that's worth more than any fancy car or high-rise office. Then there's Zell, my wife of 25 years. I met her long ago at a holiday party thrown by a friend. Social gatherings weren't really my thing, but my buddy insisted I go. She was there with a few friends, just starting her second year of law school. Right away, I knew she was different, smart, ambitious, and beautiful in a way that made people stop and take notice. She had a tough upbringing, raised by her grandmother after losing both her parents in a tragic accident when she was just a child. Her grandmother passed away while she was in college, leaving her to navigate life on her own. I could see the weight of it on her, and somehow, that night, we connected. We talked for hours about life, our struggles and our dreams. She had big aspirations, and at the time, I couldn't believe someone like her would even give me a second glance. But we clicked. After dating for a while, she started hinting that she was ready for something serious. I picked up on it, bought a ring, and proposed not long after. She said yes, and together we built a life. Our marriage wasn't a fairy tale, but it was solid. I supported her through law school, taking on extra work to cover her tuition and living expenses. When she graduated, she landed a junior position at a small law firm and worked her way up over the years, just as I continued growing my business. We raised 2 sons, Jake and Ryan, who are now adults living their own lives. For 25 years, I believe we had something steady, something real. I'm not saying it was fireworks every day, but I thought we had built a foundation of trust and hard work. That's what marriage meant to me, a reliable, steady partnership. Or at least, that's what I thought it was. Then, last year, Elle got an offer from a prestigious law firm downtown. It was a big deal, better pay, a fancy title, and an office in one of those sleek high-rises with a panoramic view of the city. She was ecstatic. Her new boss, Grant, was a high-profile attorney with a reputation for winning big cases. He thrived on the spotlight, loved seeing his face in the news, and had his name plastered on billboards across town. Elle couldn't stop talking about him. At first, it was harmless. She'd go on about how brilliant he was, how driven, how much he was learning under his guidance. I didn't think much of it. After all, we had been together for over 2 decades. Why would I have any reason to doubt her? But then, things started to shift, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. She began dressing sharper, choosing outfits that looked more refined, more expensive. There were nights she'd come home, carrying a faint scent of cologne that wasn't mine. When I'd ask about her day, she'd brush it off like it was nothing. Her work hours grew longer, more late nights, more weekend events. I often caught her glued to her phone, a small smirk playing on her lips as she typed. When I'd ask, she'd quickly put away. Then she started taking calls in private, stepping into another room, lowering her voice to a whisper. I'm not the kind of man who jumps to conclusions, and jealousy has never been in my nature. But after spending more than 2 decades with someone, you learn to recognize when something isn't right. You don't share a life with a person that long without noticing even the smallest changes. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself it was just a phase, that things would eventually go back to normal. I wanted to believe in her, to trust that whatever was happening was just a rough patch. But the more I observed, the clearer it became. Something was going on, and she wasn't even making an effort to hide it anymore. Weeks passed, and I finally reached a point where I couldn't keep pretending. One night, after yet another late return from a supposed work event, I decided it was time to confront her. I sat her down and calmly asked if there was something she needed to tell me. I didn't raise my voice, Didn't accuse her of anything. I just asked. At first, she looked taken aback, as if she hadn't expected me to notice. She fumbled for excuses, trying to deflect, but I didn't let it slide. I kept pressing, and after half an hour back and forth, she finally admitted it. She was seeing someone. She said it so casually, as if she were mentioning an overdue grocery run rather than confessing to an affair. I asked her who. That's when she said his name. Grant, her brilliant, high-powered boss. The man she had spent months praising. The one she couldn't stop talking about. She didn't even hesitate. The silence that followed was suffocating, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. But she wasn't finished. Now that the truth was out, she seemed eager to unload everything she had been holding back. She told me she needed someone on her level, someone with ambition, someone who fit the image she now wanted for herself. According to her, I had remained stagnant while she had grown. I was predictable, too comfortable in my small, steady life, while she craved more. Then she said it, the word that made my stomach turn. Grant was an alpha. She actually called him that, and the way she said it, so certain, so rehearsed, made me wonder if it was a line he had fed her himself. She kept going, her voice cool and composed, as if she were explaining an unavoidable reality that I just hadn't caught up to yet. Grant, she said, was everything I wasn't. He dressed apart, carried himself like a man of importance, someone who could give her the kind of lifestyle she deserved. Unlike me, who never cared about appearances. She gave me a once-over as she said it, her eyes lingering on my practical, everyday clothes, as if I had suddenly become an embarrassment. Grant, she continued, was a man who understood her ambition. He was clean-cut, successful, a provider, and that, apparently, was what she deserved. I sat there listening, feeling like I had somehow stepped into an alternate reality. This was my wife, the woman I had spent 25 years building a life with, and she was telling me that my loyalty, my dedication, my sacrifices, they all meant nothing, because I hadn't upgraded. I was just a small-town man with a small business and a simple life, and that no longer fit her vision of herself. Then came what she must have thought was her big solution. She told me we could stay married. For appearances, she would keep seeing Grant, and I would just have to accept it. She actually used the word arrangement, as if this were some sort of business deal rather than betrayal. According to her, Grant was perfectly fine with this setup, and if I refused, well, then I should know that Grant had a team of 20 lawyers ready to make sure I lost everything. She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was doing me a favor, like she was offering me practical advice for my own good, as if she truly believed I would just nod and go along with it. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Good luck." No yelling, no arguing, just 2 simple words. Then I got up, walked out of the room, and went upstairs without another glance. She sat there, watching me go, stunned. Clearly, she hadn't expected that response. Maybe she thought I'd beg. Maybe she thought I'd fight for her. But I wasn't about to beg for someone who had no respect for our marriage. I had said everything I needed to say. As soon as I left the room, she called him. Her voice was low, slightly unsteady, like she was trying to control her emotions. "Yes, Grant," she murmured. I told him everything. No, I didn't try to lie. I told him the truth, that I deserve better, that I want someone like you, a real man. There was a brief pause before I heard his voice on the other end, faint but unmistakable, dripping with arrogance. "You told him exactly what we discussed, right?" Grant asked, "that he should consider himself lucky to have had you this long? That he hasn't exactly been keeping you satisfied?" "Yes," she confirmed, hesitating for just a moment. But it hurt. 25 years together isn't easy to walk away from. Caleb's been a good man. He put me through school, took care of everything, raised our kids. Grant cut her off with a scoff. "Guilt? Really, Lena? Come on. That guy's a joke. A mechanic who never even tried to give you the life you deserve. He's small-time, boring. You need a real alpha to take care of you." "You're right," she said, though there was still a trace of doubt in her voice. I told him all that, but He barely reacted, just wished me good luck, and walked away. Grant chuckled. He'll have to get used to it. He needs to learn his place. Then his tone shifted, thick with smug satisfaction. By the way, you told me how much you love my... His voice trailed off, filled with self-satisfaction. You said, I take you places that old man never could. You know I did, she replied, almost breathless. But you have to understand, when I married Caleb, I didn't have that kind of experience. He's gentle, different. You're forceful, demanding. It just swept me away. That's right, Grant said, his voice practically dripping with conceit. And I'll keep sweeping you away, lover. You've got a new standard now. I'm in charge, and he's just going to have to accept it. The next morning, I left for work early. I wasn't going to sit around and listen to more of her explanations, or worse, endure the pitying looks she had started giving me. Like I was some clueless fool who just didn't understand. She had made her choice, and if she thought I would just step aside while she moved on with Grant, she was dead wrong. Around noon, while I was busy checking out a new shipment of cars at the lot, Grant showed up in person. He didn't just show up. He strutted in like he owned the place, dressed in an overpriced suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. He walked straight into my office without so much as a knock. A smug grin stretched across his face as he dropped into the chair across from me, completely uninvited. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, settling in like he was about to close some high-stakes deal. Caleb, he said smoothly, I think it's time we had a man-to-man talk. I already knew this was going to be something. He launched into his speech, talking in that self-important tone, as if he were presenting a carefully crafted business proposal instead of gloating about the destruction of my marriage. He spoke like he was some enlightened leader, graciously sharing his wisdom with the less fortunate. He droned on about how he and Elle had a deeper connection, how they were true equals, how he'd provide for her in ways that I never could. Then, locking eyes with me, that arrogant smirk still plastered on his face, he said, You're a good guy, Caleb, but men like me, we lead, we take charge, we know how to handle things. He paused, letting his words settle, then leaned in slightly, his voice lowering to a condescending whisper. You don't strike me as the type to put much of a fight, but I'll make this clear. She wants to be with a real alpha, a man who knows how to take control. I could feel my blood starting to boil. I didn't say a word. I just let him keep talking, keeping my expression unreadable. Grant didn't stop there. He slid a thick stack of documents onto my desk, giving them a deliberate tap with his fingers. Here's the deal, he said, flashing a smug, patronizing grin. Divorce papers, restraining orders, the full package. Your wife's already signed. He paused, savoring the moment like he was delivering some masterstroke. It's best for everyone if you just sign and keep things civil, he continued. No need to make this ugly. Let's be honest, Caleb. There's no point in fighting reality. You don't want to be that guy who can't move on. Then he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a near whisper. Besides, he added, laced with false sympathy, this way, you can hold on to whatever dignity you've got left. She's even willing to let you stay in her life, play the loyal ex on weekends. It's not like she's cutting you off completely. His smirk widened as he gave me what he probably thought was good advice. So be smart about this, Caleb. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. I stayed silent, letting him talk, giving him just enough space to believe he had the upper hand. He fed off it, sitting there with that self-satisfied smirk, one I imagined he had spent his entire life perfecting. Then, finally, I stood up. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, and before he could process what was happening, my fist crashed into his face. A sharp crack echoed in the room as my knuckles met his nose. He jerked backward. Stumbling, his blood dribbled down his chin, his expression twisted in stunned disbelief. That, I said, my voice steady and cold, was just the beginning. He barely had time to react before I grabbed his collar and drove an uppercut straight into his gut. The air rushed out him in a choked gasp as he crumpled forward, arms clutching his stomach. He slumped to the floor, struggling to breathe. I crouched down beside him, making sure he saw the fire in my eyes, the sheer, unshaken resolve in my face. Let me teach you something about what a real man is. I said, my voice a low growl. A real man doesn't need to throw his weight around to feel important. He doesn't walk into another man's home, try to steal his life, and call himself an alpha. I leaned in closer. A real man stands by his word, by his family, by the things he built with his own hands. Something you wouldn't understand if it smacked you in the face. Or maybe I glanced at his bloodied nose. Now you do. He groaned, his face contorted in pain. But I wasn't done. I took a step back, letting him think it was over. Then I drove my boot down on his outstretched hand. The satisfying crunch of breaking bones filled the room. His scream was raw, filled with pure agony as he tried to yank his hand away. But I pressed down harder. If you think you're going to limp out of here and run to the cops, I said, watching his eyes widen in fear, go right ahead. Maybe they'll lock me up for a few years. I leaned down, meeting his terrified gaze. But when I get out, my voice dropped to a whisper. We'll have this conversation again. And trust me, I won't be nearly as nice as I am now. The reality settled over him. The power he thought he had, the control he believed was unshakable, had just crumbled at his feet. He wasn't untouchable. He wasn't invincible. He was just another man who thought his expensive suit made him powerful. Now he knew better. I stepped back. Get up. Grant struggled to his feet, hunched over, one hand gripping his shattered nose, the other cradled uselessly against his chest. Now get out of my sight. He didn't need to be told twice. With what little dignity he had left, he staggered toward the door, bloody, broken, and humiliated, without so much as a backward glance. I shut the door behind him, feeling the slow burn of rage finally begin to cool. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later that evening, Lona paced her living room, phone pressed tightly to her ear. Grant, where are you? I thought you'd be back hours ago. There was an edge of panic in her voice, a faint tremor of fear. On the other end, Grant's voice was hoarse, sluggish. I'm in the hospital, he muttered. His tone was strained, thick with pain. Lona froze. What? What happened? Were you in an accident? Grant let out a bitter, humorless laugh. No, Lona. I went to talk to your husband, alone like we planned. And he broke me. His voice sharpened with frustration. My nose, my right hand, a couple of ribs, might have even cracked my cheekbone. Silence stretched between them. When Lona finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I don't believe it. Caleb's never been violent. That's not like him. Believe it, Grant snapped. I have the x-rays to prove it. He let out a slow, pained exhale. Your husband isn't as gentle as you thought. Lona swallowed hard. Her voice softened, almost pleading. Is there any way you don't go to the police? Caleb doesn't deserve to go to prison over this. Grant sighed. The police already came by, he admitted, but I told them it was a hit and run. His voice darkened. Because he warned me. If I pressed charges, he'd make sure I regretted it tenfold when he got out. And frankly, Lona, I'm not interested in testing him on that. Another long pause. I can't believe this, she murmured, still clinging to the idea that this wasn't real. Not my Caleb. Grant's voice turned cold. You didn't see his face when he did it, Lona. He told me this was just the beginning if I didn't back off. His bitterness was thick, the humiliation still fresh. I'm not taking any more chances with him. Lona's breath hitched. Desperation crept into her tone. So that's it? After everything, you're just giving up? There was silence. Then Grant's voice came back, flat and final. I don't have a choice. I'm doing what I need to do to survive. The line went dead. Lona stood there, gripping the phone, listening to the emptiness on the other end. Her so-called upgrade had just crumbled to dust. The next day, Lona stormed into the hospital, her appearance a mess. Hair haphazardly pulled back, dark circles under her eyes. She found Grant in a recovery room, lying in bed, his arm in a cast, his face swollen and bruised. He looked up as she entered, irritation flickering across his battered features. Grant, she started, her voice taut. You have to help me. Grant's expression remained blank as she rushed forward. I drove around all night. I didn't know if it was safe to go home. I called Caleb over and over, but he never answered. When I finally got the courage to go back, I couldn't get in. Her voice wavered. He changed the locks. Grant exhaled sharply, but said nothing. I had to stay at a friend's, she went on, her words tumbling out. And this morning, I checked our bank accounts. They're empty. None of my credit cards work. I have nothing. She took a shaky breath. You have to help me. Can you talk to one of the divorce attorneys at work? Get Caleb legally removed from the house. Grant looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. No. Lona blinked, stunned. What? No, he repeated, his voice detached. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't process what she was hearing. What do you mean, no? Grant sighed, shifting in bed with a wince. If I use company lawyers or resources to help you, it'll just give your husband more reason to come after me. He adjusted his cast, grimacing. Honestly, I think it's best if I stay out of this completely. Lona gaped at him. Stay out of this? I'll throw in an extra 4 weeks of severance, he said flatly. But that's it. Pack your things. Leave today. And if you see Caleb, tell him you were fired. That's all I'm willing to do. She staggered back a step, as if he had slapped her. Grant, She struggled to find the words. Didn't you hear me? Caleb took everything. I have no money, no job, and now you're saying you won't help me? Grant met her gaze, his bruised face unreadable. I'm sorry, Lona, he said, though there wasn't an ounce of sympathy in his tone. But you didn't see the look in your husband's eyes when he beat me. He exhaled, shaking his head. He's 10 times the man I am in that regard. His gaze hardened. And frankly, he gave her a cold, final stare. I don't need a cheating wife in my life. I think we're finished here. Her expression turned icy as she glared at him, eyes narrowing with contempt. You're pathetic, you know that, she sneered. Yesterday, you were strutting around, calling yourself an alpha male. Now you're shaking in fear because my husband, the one you said was 10 times the man you are, has you too scared to even breathe. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a scornful whisper. I can't believe I ever thought I was upgrading by choosing you, she spat. How could I have been so blind? If you ever thought I took you seriously, you were delusional. Grant's face tensed, but he said nothing. She turned on her heel and strode out without another glance, leaving him beaten, humiliated, and completely defeated. That same day, Lona sat alone in her car, parked on the side of a deserted road, her phone clutched tightly in her hands. She kept checking it over and over, but the result never changed. Every credit card transaction was declined. Her bank account were empty, and she was down her last bit of cash. Before long, even her gas would run out. Cruel? Maybe, but necessary. I'd made sure there was no safety net left for her, no one to turn to. I knew exactly where she was heading, toward our sons, probably hoping they'd take her in. But this time, there was only silence. The boys, who once responded almost instantly to her messages, had gone quiet. She let out a shaky breath, set the phone down, and stepped out of the car, smoothing her skirt as she walked toward the roadside. Sticking out her thumb, she waited for a ride. Minutes passed. Then she spotted a familiar, beat-up van approaching. As it slowed beside her, recognition flickered across her face. Panic and disbelief flashed in her eyes when she saw me behind the wheel. I stepped out, motioning toward the passenger seat. We need to talk, I said simply. She hesitated, her body rigid with tension, but finally she got in, staring at me as if I were a stranger. She looked exhausted, like the last few days had drained the life out of her. I didn't waste words. Here's how this is going to go. I began, my voice even. You're filing for divorce. There will be no alimony, no claim to my assets. Everything I own stays mine. Everything you have, you keep. Any jewelry I bought you, you'll return it. I let my words sink in before continuing. I don't care what reason you put on the paperwork. List whatever makes you feel better. Just know this, you're out of my life. She swallowed hard, saying nothing. Once the divorce is finalized, you leave town. You don't look back. You can reach out to our kids. if they want to talk to you, but only in my absence, and only on their terms. I shifted slightly, my tone unwavering. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Your things will be packed and ready for pickup. Be there on time. If they're not gone by 11, I met her eyes, my expression cold. They burn. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like she was seeing a ghost instead of the man she once knew. Her voice was barely a whisper. When can I expect the papers? A week, I said. You have 5 days. She nodded again, her gaze distant, as if staring at something far beyond me. I looked at her one last time. She was pale, shaken, finally understanding the weight of her choices. A small smirk tugged at my lips. Get out. She stepped out of the van without another word, and I drove off without looking back, leaving her standing there alone, stranded, exactly where she had left me long ago. The next morning, at 10:30, she arrived to collect her belongings. 5 days later, the divorce papers were sitting on my desk. Under reason, she had written irreconcilable differences. I actually laughed. Months later, it was finalized. I was free. Do I have regrets? Maybe a few. I regret that she never understood what loyalty meant. I regret that she saw me as less than, that she believed I wasn't enough for the new version of her life. And maybe she never truly grasped the danger of betraying a man who knows what it means to stand his ground and protect what's his. Would I have fought for our marriage? Maybe, if she hadn't treated me as an obstacle to be removed. If she hadn't threatened me, thinking she could dictate how things would end. But she made her choice. And that was the moment I stopped looking back. I'll move on. I'll live my life alone, if that's how it has to be. And maybe one day I'll die alone. But I'd rather that, a life of solitude and self-respect, than spend another second with someone who never understood the meaning of honor and loyalty.